Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch is somebody we've spoken to before. She's a Texas immigration attorney, and I wanted to have her come back so we could talk about this temporary protected status for these Venezuelan nationals, how it works and what it means. Kate, thank you so much for joining us again.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to come back.
So explain to those of my listeners who may not have heard of what the Biden administration did. They may not understand this extended temporary protection status. What is it the Biden administration did?
Sure. So TPS, temporary protected status, is a method by which our government or president can provide protected status to people who are in the United States and something occurs in their country, they can't go back. So you can think of like the earthquake in Haiti or an Ebola outbreak, in Africa, or things like that. And what can happen in those moments is the president will say, I'm going to authorize TPS status to nationals from that country so that they can stay in the United States, because right now is not a time that they can go back to their country. And with TPS status, people get work permission. So what we've had is TPS status for Venezuelans now for a couple of years. But the requirement for TPS is that at the point that it is announced by the president, that it only applies to people who are already in the United States, because otherwise it would be an invitation to everyone from that country to come, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really meant to cover the people who are already in the United States. And so what was interesting or different about this TPS announcement is that the Biden administration moved up the date of eligibility. So they said that before, anyone who came in before March of 2021 was eligible, so all the new arrivals wouldn't qualify. Now, any Venezuelan who entered the country before July 31st of this year can be eligible for TPS. So extended the eligibility forward to include a lot more Venezuelans who are already in the country. It does not help Venezuelans who are in Mexico or in Venezuela, for example.
Last time I was talking about immigration, there were a number of people who called in. Some of them were sharing, Fox Cable talking points, but there's still this whole idea that somehow this is taking jobs away from regular American citizens. Do you believe that?
No, I absolutely do not believe that. The situation is that our economy in all sectors of industry has a need for labor, from high-skilled semiconductor industry engineers, graduates, down to agriculture, hotel industry, meat processing plants, et cetera, need labor. They need employees in all sectors. And the beautiful thing for this country is that we have so many people from around the globe who would come here in an instant and fill those positions. That is not true for other nations that are experiencing the same problems. We have a quick solution to our problem. And so it's just not accurate that immigrants are taking jobs. In fact, the data shows that immigrants create more jobs than they take, because they tend overall, from a macro perspective, to be more entrepreneurial and to start businesses that then create more job opportunities. So overall, if you look at what does immigration do to our economy, it grows the economy, it creates jobs as opposed to taking jobs.
That is very interesting to me. That is not a statistic that I'm familiar with. Who has gathered that information?
I've looked at a ton of different economic studies on this, and the vast majority find that immigration is a net benefit or job creator. There are very few, some who say it's sort of a net nothing, right, to the economy. And in my research, what I have seen is that the studies that show that immigrants take jobs are skewed, they're politically motivated, and they're not based in reliable data.
I read one article that said that the main impetus for the Biden administration to extend this temporary protected status was because of outreach from New York City Mayor Eric Adams. Was he the driving force behind this?
I think the New York thing is very interesting. And, the New York City mayor issued this letter in the New York Times. It's been very loud. There are migrants in New York City who are, being housed in hotels. And I'm based in Texas, so I personally have not had the opportunity to speak to these migrants. But I actually do have one of my team members who went to go talk to some of these migrants, because I said, in my experience, asylum-seeking migrants, that 90% of them, this is in my experience in research, 90% of them have somewhere to go, an intended place to go. They have family in the United States or they have friends in the United States. And so when we see busloads of migrants or groups of migrants show up, usually that's because, state governors have gotten involved and they've sort of taken migrants out of the normal flow of what happens. They get processed at the border. They go to the Greyhound station. Maybe they get some services at a, nonprofit at the border. And then they bus themselves to California or Maryland or wherever it is that they are intending to go. But when, Ron DeSantis or Greg Abbott come in and they bus people to Washington, D.C., all of a sudden that puts these people in a place where they weren't intending. They don't have resources. Maybe their phones are dead. And so it creates this sort of artificial crisis in that location, which, gets the attention that it is intended to get. And so my suspicion is that that's at least at play with what's going on in New York. So I sent one of my team members to talk to some of these migrants in New York, and she is bilingual in English and Spanish, but wasn't able to communicate with these people because they weren't Spanish speakers, which to me is very interesting, because I'm still unclear about, for the migrants in New York, what countries have they come from? How did they get themselves to New York? Where were they processed into the country? And why are hundreds of them in New York City? That is a mystery, and I haven't seen proper reporting on that. And the other thing I think it's interesting to note is that New York City, as far as I understand it, has passed a city ordinance where the city will pay the cost of lodging for any houseless person, including migrants and refugees. So the city has gotten itself into this financial situation with its own policy. So I think that, to me, there's a lot more questions about what's happening in New York than there are answers. That's very weird. Much of what you just shared with us, I had not heard before. And there has been reporting in Chicago, because we have been recipients of some of these buses that have been showing up. As a matter of fact, we just had recently 12 buses with more than 560 asylum seekers arrive over the weekend. And there are reports of drug use. There are reports of fights breaking out. And a Chicago Tribune reporter went to one of the shelters and spoke to a woman who's there with her kids from Venezuela. And she essentially, corroborated that there are what she describes as a small number of people who are really causing a lot of problems. And she's very worried that if sentiment starts running against migrants, people like her who are following the rules and trying to be very upstanding will be also, thrown out along with the bad apples. Is this sort of problem that this Biden administration move is hopefully going to address, Kate, or is this something else? Well, I think it's a fascinating question and situation, and I think she's right to be afraid. And I think that there is an element, like we were talking about before the break, there is an element of the buses exacerbating or even creating the issue. I was just sort of, as the break happened, I went and just sort of Googled to see like what new news articles I could find about this. And there's this PBS article, and the last two paragraphs say, but the Migration Policy Institute wrote that the Republican-sponsored trips had repercussions far beyond numbers. After crossing the southern border, migrants used to spread organically, quietly, and gradually across the U.S., the Institute wrote. The buses have instead brought migrants to these cities in an orchestrated, visible, and deliberately disorderly way. In generating this chaos, the busing scheme has succeeded at least in showcasing the challenges at the border, the organization wrote. So that sort of backs up what I think is going on. And so what we're experiencing is that, people are out of the natural flow of where they were going to go. And of course, they're human beings. So there might be troublemakers. In a group of 50 people, you're probably going to have a handful of troublemakers. So the question you asked me is whether the Biden administration's move to grant TPS to Venezuelans will reduce issues. I mean, I think that it will, because typically if a Venezuelan comes in and they're seeking asylum, they're not going to be eligible to get work permission for about 9 months just because of the laws and processing times, or maybe even longer. And needless to say, that is a very challenging period of time for someone. If they don't have legal work permission, they've probably spent all of their savings just getting themselves to the United States, and they're destitute. Many times they're trying to figure out how to feed their families. With TPS, they can immediately qualify and get work permission, and that gets them to a more stable situation much more quickly. And another benefit is that in many cases, they can then exempt themselves from the court proceedings. And the immigration court system is overburdened. There's millions of cases that are pending in the court system. So taking out certain cases would also alleviate the backlog for the other types of cases that maybe should take priority before the immigration judges.
I've said before that since it seems like no one can stop Texas Governor Greg Abbott from putting these people on buses and shipping them to Democratic cities, can't the federal government say, okay, you regularly get X number of migrants, and for that we send you X millions of dollars. But hey, since you're sending them on buses to other cities, we are going to take X millions of dollars away from you and share it with the places where the migrants are actually showing up. I believe that is the only thing that would slow this whole Greg Abbott publicity machine down. But it doesn't seem to be something either that people will do or maybe they can't do. Am I proposing something that's wildly illegal here?
Well, I guess there's a couple of things to consider. I mean, the first is, would that even have an impact? I mean, I can tell you as a Texan, Greg Abbott has spent $10 billion on Operation Lone Star, which is the state's immigration law enforcement project, which has accounted for fewer than 1% of the apprehensions along the border, by the way. So it's also ineffective. That $10 billion represents 1/6 of our overall educational budget for 1 year in the state, just to sort of give context of how much money is being spent. So I think a financial consequence would not have an impact on Abbott's behavior. And I think that Abbott is frankly winning here with all of this, because the amount of attention and support and donations he is getting for these activities of his. I mean, he's, essentially responsible for people dying in the river. And I know, just based from my own information dissemination, my own, like social media stuff, the comments that I get is that there are a lot of people out there who are rabidly in support of what he is doing. And so I think those people would also say, oh, you're busing all these people to other cities and other states and you're making it their problem and Chicago is suffering. Great. We support that. I think that that's how many, I should say, Texans would feel. So then the question is, could it even occur? I mean, I think probably the legal response to that is, the federal government doesn't give state governments money unless there's little grants and little thises and that's. But from a macro perspective, the federal government does not fund states for immigrants because immigrants support themselves. So I think that I don't know that there is a program. I'm not an expert on federal and state funding and money exchange, but I don't know off the top of my head of a program that could be cut, for example, in exchange for the stoppage of this behavior.
Do you think that this temporary extended work status is going to be significant in easing the tensions, or do we need something else or something more?
I don't think it's going to make a dent. The reality of the situation is that we are not in an acute emergency. Our numbers are high, but they're not high if you compare them to 15 years ago. I mean, we just have fluctuations of migration based on, political unrest in places, based on environmental situations, based on our fluctuating policies. Like Title 42 was in place and closed the border for 3 years. Now that's been revoked because the pandemic has shifted. So all of a sudden, 3 years of people who never got the chance to apply for asylum are a few months, that ended in May. Here we are like 3 or 4 months later. So we're just dealing with the impacts of fluctuating, policies and situation around the globe. And I think the mistake that we could make in this situation is to say, like, gosh, there's people at hotels in New York City, and that must mean we really do have an invasion. But I think that there is a sort of calculated plan to make it look and feel that way. And so my perspective on this is that we recognize that this is the United States of America. We have a need for immigrants and immigrant labor. We have a very secure border and an impressive budget to the Department of Homeland Security. And we have a way to do this. We have a way to process and screen asylum seekers in a dignified way. That doesn't mean everybody gets in and qualifies, for sure. But all we need to do is focus on, like, okay, what's the orderly processing mechanism that we want to put in place, set it, stick it, follow it, and then let migrants who qualify to come in take themselves to wherever it is that they're going, so we don't have this chaos of, groups of migrants being taken to Chicago when that wasn't their intended destination. It's really like we just need to get back to the basics, and this will all smooth out. But I think that the fact that this is happening as we head into an election year is not a surprise at all. And fear is a very strong motivator for an electorate. And so anytime someone's tempted to watch this stuff and get afraid, just dig in a little bit deeper. Just do some research. Don't just trust, headlines and certainly, I would say, conservative politicians' tweets.
I've had a number of callers in the last month call in and say, well, we have open borders now. The border is completely open. You don't seem to agree that we have open borders, Kate.
Open borders is this phrase that is just like, can you imagine? Can you imagine if we actually had open borders, what that would look like? We have the most impressive, Border Patrol budget and team. We do not have a porous border. You know what we used to? In the 90s, it was really easy for people to just cross and work and go back, and we had a porous border at that point, and we have it now for over a decade. And what we had in place during the Trump presidency was Title 42, which was a COVID era closure of the border. And when we lifted the COVID emergency, the Biden administration lifted the COVID closure of the border, as he had to. The Supreme Court held that, essentially. And so now what we're dealing with is, okay, how do we process asylum seekers? So 70 years ago, post-World War II, we failed as a nation to protect Jewish refugees who are fleeing the Holocaust. And there was an international reckoning post-World War II where we defined what is a refugee, and we as a nation committed to protecting people who are fleeing persecution in their countries. And we have written that into our laws. We've codified it. We have regulations. We have case law. We have robust policies built out for decades based on this commitment of ours. And that's all we're doing is just getting back to that because Trump shut it off, and now we're getting back to it. We don't have open borders. That's absurd.
Yeah. Kate, thank you. As always, you're bringing way too much common sense into the discussion, which is really useful for me and my audience. Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch is a Texas immigration attorney, someone that I hope we can have on this show on a regular basis. You are knowledgeable and you are able to explain all this stuff in a way that's very understandable, Kate. And I thank you again for taking time to talk with us.
Yeah, I'd love to come back. Thanks for having me on.